Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome back. Today we're diving deep into two major historical moments. The Treaty of Versailles back in 1919 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 91.
Two very different events on the surface.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's really what makes this so fascinating. Both were meant to usher in peace and stability, but both had unforeseen consequences that are still relevant today.
Echoes.
Echoes, exactly. So our goal today is to examine those echoes, those underlying currents that connect these events, and see what lessons we can take away for navigating today's world, which, let's be honest, is pretty complex.
It is indeed. And to really understand those echoes, we need to understand the events themselves. Starting with the Treaty of Versailles. It was, of course, more than just a peace treaty.
It was an attempt to reorder the entire world
Exactly.
after the First World War.
After that devastation, yes. And central to that reordering was holding Germany accountable.
And that's where the War Guilt Clause comes in. Article 231, forcing Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war.
Imagine the weight of that, to be told your entire nation is to blame for such a cataclysmic conflict.
Yeah, that's a heavy burden. And it wasn't just the blame. They were also saddled with massive reparations payments, 132 billion gold marks, meant to cripple their economy, really.
It was a way to prevent Germany from rising again as a military threat. They also lost significant territory.
Alsace-Lorraine to France, parts of eastern Germany to the newly formed Poland.
Right. And of course, severe restrictions on their military. Army size slashed, conscription banned, and development of advanced weaponry prohibited.
Basically trying to keep Germany permanently subdued.
You could say that. But the unintended consequence was this powder keg of resentment, economic hardship, national humiliation.
A breeding ground for extremism.
As we know.
Now fast forward to 1991. The seemingly invincible Soviet Union implodes. Not from outside pressure like Germany, this was from within.
Right. And it's crucial to grasp the context here. The Soviet system, based on centralized economic planning, was failing to deliver. Shortages were widespread, productivity was declining, and the gap between the Soviet Union and the West widening.
These were the cracks in the foundation.
Indeed. And then you have Gorbachev's reforms, perestroika and glasnost, intended to revitalize the system, but they may have actually sped up its demise.
Ironic, isn't it?
It is. By allowing greater freedom of expression, these reforms inadvertently unleashed a wave of nationalism within the Soviet republics, long suppressed under Soviet rule.
And they saw a chance to break free.
Exactly.
So here we have these two seemingly very different events. A treaty imposed after a devastating war and a superpower collapsing from within. Yet both created power vacuums, leaving unresolved issues ripe for exploitation.
And it's in those unresolved issues, those smoldering embers of discontent, that we see the seeds of future conflict being sown.
A legacy of resentment, instability, and these really complex questions about national identity and borders. That's where the parallels truly start to emerge.
So let's dig deeper into how these events fueled nationalist sentiment, and we'll start with Germany post-Versailles. You know, the public anger over the treaty being perceived as unfair, well, it was palpable.
Yeah, it wasn't just that war guilt clause. It was the economic hardship, the loss of territory, the military restrictions. There was just this collective sense of injustice that really permeated German society.
And that's where figures like Hitler and the Nazi Party, they saw their opening. They were masters at exploiting this discontent, channeling it through propaganda, and really directing public anger towards scapegoats.
Yeah, the treaty itself became this symbol of national humiliation.
Right.
And the Nazis, they were very effective at using it to blame the Jews, communists, the Weimar Republic, anyone, really, for all of Germany's problems.
And they promised a return to greatness, a restoration of German pride.
And ultimately revenge.
Yeah. Revenge. And as we know, this toxic mix of nationalism and resentment, well, it had catastrophic consequences. It paved the way for World War II. Now let's shift our focus to Russia after the Soviet collapse. We see a similar dynamic, though it is more nuanced.
Yeah, the sudden loss of superpower status, coupled with just the utter economic turmoil of the 1990s, created this, sense of national disorientation and humiliation for a lot of Russians, like going from a global superpower to seeing your country's influence and economy just crumble.
Exactly. A jarring experience.
It is.
And into this void steps Vladimir Putin, And he very skillfully harnessed these feelings of disillusionment and nostalgia for that, bygone era of Soviet strength. He even called the Soviet collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century.
And that resonated with a lot of Russians.
Oh, absolutely. People who yearned for that stability, for national pride.
And, Putin's brand of nationalism, while it's different from the Nazi ideology in Germany, it still served as a powerful tool to consolidate his power and justify his foreign policy, especially towards former Soviet republics like Ukraine.
A classic example of a leader capitalizing on existing grievances, channeling them towards specific political goals.
So, the manipulation of nationalist sentiment in both Germany and Russia, it highlights how potent and potentially dangerous this force can be.
It can be. Now, moving beyond the emotional and the psychological impact, I think we should examine some of the tangible consequences of these events, and specifically how the redrawing of borders contributed to future instability.
Both World War I and the Soviet collapse, they radically altered the maps of Europe.
They did.
And these changes, well, they had some very lasting repercussions.
After Versailles, we saw the emergence of new nation-states, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, all emerging from the remnants of defeated empires.
Right, and these new borders, they were often drawn hastily, with little regard for existing ethnic and cultural divisions.
Yeah, they created as many problems as they solved.
They did. Millions found themselves living in newly formed countries, often as minorities, subject to discrimination or resentment from the majority population.
Yes, and in Germany's case, the loss of territories like the Polish corridor, separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany, that created a very potent source of grievance, one that Hitler later exploited.
Oh, absolutely. To justify his expansionist ambitions.
He played on this idea of uniting all Germans under one flag.
Right, using those perceived injustices of Versailles to fuel his aggressive foreign policy.
Fast forward to the post-Soviet landscape, you see a similar pattern emerge, but on a much larger scale. The dissolution of the Soviet Union gave birth to 15 new independent states.
15?
But again, the borders, they often reflected administrative divisions from the Soviet era, not historical or ethnic realities.
Which created a volatile situation.
Many volatile situations, especially in regions with mixed populations and competing claims.
Like the Caucasus.
Right, with its conflicts in Nagorno-Karabakh, Transnistria, and Abkhazia.
And of course, the especially thorny case of Crimea, a peninsula with a majority Russian-speaking population that was transferred from Russia to Ukraine back in the 1950s.
A decision made within the Soviet system, which became a major flashpoint after Ukraine's independence.
Yeah, and this historical baggage, these hastily drawn borders and unresolved territorial disputes, it continues to fuel tensions and conflicts in the post-Soviet space.
It does. Both Versailles and the Soviet collapse offer really compelling examples of how redrawing maps can have these far-reaching and often unintended consequences, creating new sources of conflict and instability that can last for generations.
Yeah, we've seen how nationalist sentiments and border disputes played out in the wake of these two events, but I think there's another critical factor to consider: the failure of international security mechanisms to prevent or even manage the escalating tensions that followed.
It's true. The promises of peace and security, these guarantees that were meant to prevent future conflicts, well, they turned out to be tragically hollow.
They did. So let's examine how this played out in the post-World War I era. You have the League of Nations. It was established with a lot of hope and idealism.
It was.
But it ultimately proved to be a toothless watchdog.
It lacked the enforcement power to compel its members to act decisively against aggressors. And its reliance on collective security, well, that was undermined by the self-interest of individual nations.
Absolutely.
And of course, crucially, some of the most powerful nations, like the United States, never even joined the League, which further weakened its authority right from the start.
Right from the start. So when faced with challenges like Japanese aggression in Manchuria, or Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, or even Hitler's remilitarization of the Rhineland, the League was largely powerless to intervene effectively.
Its response was hesitant and often ineffective. It really just emboldened those aggressors.
And it demonstrated the international community's unwillingness, or maybe inability, to uphold their commitments to peace.
Maybe both.
Yeah, perhaps the most striking example of this failure is the Munich Agreement of 1938.
Yes. Desperate to avoid war, Britain and France appeased Hitler by allowing him to annex the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia.
A territory with a large German population.
Exactly, and a decision that was made without Czechoslovakia's consent, a betrayal that really shattered any remaining faith in the League's ability to protect smaller nations from aggression.
And this pattern of appeasement, this reluctance to confront aggression early on, it really paved the way for Hitler's bolder moves and the outbreak of World War II.
Now let's shift to the post-Soviet era. We see a different but equally troubling example of failed security guarantees, the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. Ukraine agrees to give up its nuclear arsenal, the third largest in the world at that time,
Wow, the third largest.
in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom.
So essentially, Ukraine traded away its most powerful deterrent in exchange for promises.
Promises on paper.
Yeah, promises of respect for its sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Promises that, as we've seen in recent years, proved tragically inadequate.
Yeah. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and then started supporting separatists in eastern Ukraine, the Western response was largely limited to economic sanctions and, diplomatic condemnation.
No military intervention to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity, a clear indication that the Budapest Memorandum lacked any real enforcement mechanisms.
And this failure to act decisively to uphold the commitments made to Ukraine, well, it's had some profound consequences.
It has. It's eroded trust in international agreements, emboldened Russia's ambitions, and raised some very serious questions about the effectiveness of security guarantees when they're not backed by a credible military deterrent.
And what's even more troubling is the precedent this sets for other nations that might be considering nuclear disarmament.
The lesson for some might be that relinquishing nuclear weapons in exchange for promises on paper is a fool's bargain. It could lead to vulnerability and betrayal on the world stage.
We've talked about nationalism, borders, and those failed security mechanisms, but there's another crucial element that connects the Treaty of Versailles and the Soviet collapse: economic turmoil. It's often said that economic hardship breeds instability. And in both these historical cases, we see it play out, really dramatically.
Absolutely. Economic instability was a major factor in shaping the political landscape, both in post-Versailles Germany and post-Soviet Russia. In Germany, it was the reparations imposed by the treaty, coupled with the loss of key industrial regions. It crippled their economy.
Imagine the impact on everyday Germans. The reparations, the overall economic downturn. It led to hyperinflation in the early 1920s. And that just wiped out savings and created widespread hardship, especially for the middle class.
Think about it. You've worked your whole life, saved diligently, and suddenly, overnight, your savings are practically worthless.
It's devastating.
It was a time of profound economic and social upheaval, fertile ground for extremist movements promising solutions.
And then, adding fuel to the fire, you have the French and Belgian occupation of the Ruhr Valley in 1923. It just exacerbated the economic crisis.
Right, a direct consequence of Germany's inability to keep up with those reparation payments. And it led to passive resistance, strikes, even more economic chaos.
And as if things weren't bad enough, the Great Depression hit Germany particularly hard in the early 1930s.
Unemployment soared.
This perfect storm of economic woes just fueled public discontent and eroded faith in the Weimar Republic. It made those radical promises of the Nazi Party all the more appealing.
You could say that the economic turmoil of the 1920s and early 30s paved the way for Hitler's rise to power.
Yeah, it did. Now, shifting our attention to Russia after the Soviet collapse, we see such a stark example of how economic hardship can have really profound political consequences. That transition from a centrally planned economy to a market-based system, it was chaotic.
To say the least. It was the era of shock therapy reforms, and while intended to rapidly transition Russia to a market economy, it actually led to the rise of the oligarchs.
And widespread corruption.
And a dramatic decline in living standards for many Russians. The economic pain was real, and millions were plunged into poverty as the social safety net that existed under the Soviet system just crumbled.
Yeah. And that economic instability coupled with, that sense of national humiliation, loss of status, it created a yearning for a strong leader who could restore order and prosperity.
And that's where Putin steps in, promising stability, economic revival, and a restoration of Russia's standing in the world.
And his popularity, it was built in part on his ability to exploit those economic anxieties and resentments that lingered from those chaotic 1990s. So both in Germany and Russia, we see a clear connection between economic hardship and the rise of, these strongmen figures who promise to restore national pride and prosperity. And it really underscores a crucial point. Economic instability often creates opportunities for those who can channel public discontent and offer seemingly simple solutions to complex problems. So we've explored these parallels between these two historical moments, but now it's time to consider what lessons do they hold for understanding the current geopolitical tensions, particularly the conflict involving Ukraine. Do these echoes of the past offer any insights into the present?
They do. A lot of observers have drawn comparisons between the West's appeasement of Nazi Germany in the 1930s and its response to Russia's annexation of Crimea back in 2014.
Yeah. Both instances involved a reluctance to confront that aggression directly, prioritizing the avoidance of conflict at almost any cost.
Right. And in both cases, this hesitancy was based on a miscalculation, I think, of the aggressor's intentions and a failure to appreciate the potential consequences of an action.
Yeah, just as Hitler misinterpreted the West's appeasement as weakness, emboldening him to make more aggressive moves, Putin might have viewed the, well, relatively muted response to Crimea as a green light for further expansion.
It raises some serious questions about the effectiveness of deterrence, the role of international law, the credibility of security guarantees in the 21st century. It also highlights the dangerous precedent that's set when international agreements are violated without serious consequences.
It's a slippery slope. You have the erosion of trust in the international system, the emboldening of aggressors, and that potential for localized conflicts to escalate into larger wars. These are all very real risks.
They are. And of course, we can't ignore the elephant in the room. Nuclear weapons. That's a factor that distinguishes the current situation from the 1930s. These weapons raise the stakes considerably, making any potential conflict far more dangerous and unpredictable.
Absolutely. It underscores the need for, careful diplomacy, strong deterrence, and just a clear understanding of the potential consequences of miscalculation. However, even though there are these parallels, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are some significant differences between those historical contexts.
Right. The world today is far more interconnected, economically, technologically. And because of that, the costs of a large-scale conflict are potentially much higher. And I think the global community is, well, arguably, more aware of the dangers of unchecked aggression.
Yeah. We also have institutions like the United Nations and NATO, which, while they're imperfect, offer mechanisms for cooperation and conflict resolution that just weren't there in the 1930s.
True.
So while history can offer these valuable insights and these cautionary tales, I don't think it can provide a simple roadmap for navigating today's complexities.
It can't. But there are some key takeaways from our exploration that I think are worth emphasizing. First and foremost, early and decisive action against aggression. Appeasement, as history has shown time and again, rarely works.
It doesn't. Yeah. And often just delays the inevitable.
It does. Second, the need for robust international institutions and mechanisms for enforcing those agreements. Empty promises and paper guarantees aren't enough. There needs to be a credible deterrent to prevent violations and ensure that international law is respected.
And finally, the importance of diplomacy and communication. While deterrence is essential, so too is the need to engage in dialogue, understand different perspectives, and seek those peaceful resolutions to disputes. In essence, the challenge for policymakers is to learn from the mistakes of the past while recognizing the unique challenges of the present.
Finding that balance between firmness and diplomacy, upholding those international norms while avoiding the escalation of tensions, and to navigate a world that's, well, more interconnected and more dangerous than ever before.
It's a tough job. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, the question that lingers is this. How can we apply these lessons learned from the Treaty of Versailles and the Soviet collapse to effectively address those current geopolitical tensions and prevent the mistakes of the past from being repeated? It's a question that demands careful consideration from all of us, both as individuals and as a global community. Thanks for joining us, 2024.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.